first major impression left on me with my time with the Switch 2 so far has been the eShop experience. eShop experience on the Switch 2 is improved in basically almost every way possible. You can doom scroll to your heart's content, and everything just feels like it's snappy and fast. It loads really quick. When you're loading in a new section of games in the feed, it happens really quickly. Whereas on the Switch 1, in case you forgot what that looks like, it's slow, it's clunky, everything is super laggy, it's a mess. Hopefully with the Switch 2 experience being improved and performance being much better, it's just easier to keep finding things. The next thing has been backwards compatibility, both with software and with hardware. With software, Switch 1 carts will work on the Switch 2. Nintendo has a graph that basically shows almost everything released on the Switch 1 is more or less compatible with the Switch 2. One thing I will say is, as I was going through and testing some of my Switch carts on the Switch 2, is that when I put in a Switch 1 cart and then tried to load the game, every time I did this, there would be a pop-up saying that something couldn't be found, and then I'd have to try to download it. I couldn't find a way to try to start the game without doing this download, and I think the download is basically a Switch 2 compatibility patch for every game that you're going to load. And so I think that you will have to use the internet for at least a small amount of time for every game that you're trying to use that's a Switch 1 game on the Switch 2. With digital downloads, when it comes to backwards compatibility, there is something that I feel some type of way about. Nintendo, with the Switch 2, has introduced a thing called the virtual game card, which is like a digital representation of a physical game card. It's more so mimicking how you would be able to use that physical game card with a digital purchase. So on your Switch 1, if you have a bunch of digital downloads, and then you buy a Switch 2, and then you do an account transfer to your Switch 2, if you go back to your Switch 1 and try to play those digital games, you're now going to be presented with this virtual game card where it's going to bring up this screen and it's going to say that you have to unload the digital game card from your Switch 2 and then load it into your Switch 1 if you want to play it on your Switch 1. Then if you do that, the game is no longer available to you to just boot up on your Switch 2. If you wanted to then go back and play it on your Switch 2, you have to unload it from your Switch 1 and then load it back into your Switch 2. This feels like an unnecessary complication for a lot of people. I think they're just going to be blown away. Like, I already bought this thing from the eShop. Why can't I just play it on the 2 pieces of hardware that I own? It just feels like it's a way to gatekeep digital purchases to make people just buy them again. As far as hardware compatibility goes, all of the Bluetooth controllers for the Switch 1 work with the Switch 2, which is amazing. This is my original Pro controller for the Switch 1, and I can use this out of the box with the Switch 2. One thing I will say, Nintendo notes it in some of their documentation, but I didn't hear about this and only experienced it once I got my hands on my Switch 2, is that you can't wake the Switch 2 from a non-Switch 2 controller. So if you're using an older controller and you try to hit the home button while the Switch 2 is off, nothing is going to happen. You're going to have to physically turn the Switch 2 on, and then at that point, you can start using your controller again. Right? Since we're on the topic of backwards compatibility with controllers, if you're using older controllers that are based on the Joy-Cons, so like the Switch 1 Joy-Cons use this rail system, the Switch 2 uses a magnet system, so this is not going to be compatible. If it's Bluetooth, it will still work in Bluetooth mode, but if you have to connect it physically onto the Nintendo Switch, these just aren't going to work anymore. And that leads me into the next thing that I have for my first week with the Switch 2, and that's going to be the Nintendo GameCube app for Switch Online. With the Nintendo GameCube app for Switch Online, we can now play GameCube games on the Nintendo Switch. This app is locked to be only usable on the Switch 2, so if you have a Switch 1, you can't use this app, which sucks and is stupid. And with the GameCube app, there's good things and there's bad things about it. The good news with this GameCube app is that the games that are all on here so far, so we have F-Zero, we have Soul Calibur 2, and we have Wind Waker, they all present in an upscaled HD resolution. They all look and play really well on the Switch 2. The weird thing about this, though, is Nintendo's Switch Online emulator just lacks basic features that emulators have had for decades. And in this case, you can take some of the games and make them widescreen, which is something that's just driven me insane about Nintendo's emulators. On F-Zero and Soul Calibur 2, Within the game's menus, you can select screen ratio or screen aspect. I forgot what it's called. It's called something different in both games, but you can change it to be full screen in those two games, but you cannot do that in Wind Waker, which is mind-boggling to me, especially given that the standard aspect ratio image that you get is like an upscaled HD version of the version of GameCube. So why can we not just further make this full screen? I have a Retroid Pocket 5, which allows me to run the Dolphin emulator, and I can take the GameCube version of Wind Waker and I can run it at the same graphic fidelity as on the Switch 2 and even higher. And I can full screen the thing, which is something like all emulators is like a basic capability of all emulators. And I bet the Switch Online emulator is actually capable of doing this, but Nintendo has like locked this feature out. I can also take my Retroid Pocket 5, put it in a dock, and then immediately play the game on a screen. And so I get this same Switch 2 capability, except I can run the emulator myself, I can control the emulator, I can control what goes into the emulator, and it's a cheaper package than the Switch 2. So for the GameCube app to be kind of a selling feature of the Switch 2, it's still very limited in what you can do with it. Once I put the Joy-Cons on the Switch 2 and kind of got a real good glimpse of the size of this thing, the Switch 2 is a big handheld. It is definitely bigger than the Switch 1. If you were to like stack these things on top of each other, you can kind of get a good idea of how much bigger the Switch 2 is than the Switch 1, which definitely will affect its portability. When I would travel and go places for work and stuff, I would just throw my Switch 2 in a case and throw it in my backpack and wouldn't think anything of it. But now Switch 2 is at a size where I would think twice about how much space this thing plus a case is going to take up in my backpack or whatever, and maybe I don't travel with it as much. When it comes to comparing the controls and buttons and stuff that you'll find on the physical devices itself, they are more or less the same. You'll have power button, volume rocker. However, with the Switch 2, there's a USB-C port on the top and one on the bottom, so you can theoretically charge the Switch 2 from the top or the bottom, depending on what is most convenient for you at the time. The Switch 2 Joy-Cons are bigger than the Switch 1. However, the buttons are basically like the exact same spacing apart. The Switch 2 buttons may be a little bit bigger, but like the layout of them is exactly the same thing as the Switch 1 as far as I can tell. It's just the area of the actual Joy-Con itself is bigger than the Joy-Con 1s. The Joy-Con 2s, like I was saying, use a magnet to connect to the Switch as opposed to the Joy-Con 1s, which use the rail system. And I think the Joy-Con 2s are also non-Hall effect analog sticks, so Joy-Con drift is still going to be a thing that is potentially going to be experienced with these new Joy-Con. Now, looking at the physical differences between the docks for the Nintendo Switches, the Nintendo Switch 1 dock just feels more solid and more durable to me than the Switch 2's dock. The Switch also had like a nice door on the back of it for all the connections. So like the HDMI connection, the power connection, you could just lower the door, connect the things, close the door, and it is a very simple thing to do. On the Switch 2, there's a back cover plate that you pull out, a small number of pegs on the back of the cover plate that connect into the Switch dock itself. And I just feel like those things are going to end up breaking off at some point for most people. And putting it back on is such an annoying experience because you're trying to line up these holes, plus deal with the wires that are connected to the back of the dock. And the whole experience is just a downgrade, honestly, from the Switch 1 dock. And I don't know why this decision was made. At this point, I just leave the back cover plate off of my Switch 2 dock just because I don't want to deal with it. And there's no real point in having it connected that I've found. Another difference between the Switch 1 and the Switch 2 dock, one of the things on the Switch 1 dock was that people always thought that the Switch would fit in the dock too tight to the point where you would see little marks left by the dock on the screen. And I think they tried to fix that with the Switch 2. However, in the Switch 2 dock, the Switch wobbles in there. If you, like, when you put it in there, you can wobble it around, which may or may not lead to new problems coming up. It specifically concerns me about the USB connector on the bottom of the Switch and that much wobbling happening. I don't know if that may end up breaking off the USB connector in the dock at some point, or if that just may lead to some weird issue with if you accidentally hit the Switch while it's in the dock, that might crack the screen or scratch the screen somehow because there's that movement with the Switch happening. And my final, I think, impression with my time with the Switch so far this week is that the launch lineup it kind of reminds me of the 3DS launch lineup, honestly. The launch lineup isn't good. I'm relying more so on the previous system to supply the software that I'm using on the new hardware, in that like the Switch 1 carts are cheaper. You're basically getting the same Switch 1 carts with the Switch 2 updates as Switch 2 releases, all outside of Mario Kart World as far as the Switch 2 launch lineup goes. And it's like I would just rather play the Switch 1 games on the Switch 2 because they're cheaper. And I think at this point, a lot of people already have the Switch 1 carts. And also, with the Switch 1 carts, I have noticed that they just look and present much cleaner and crisper and vibrant on the Switch 2. So I think part of that Switch 2 patch update that gets applied and downloaded once you try running a Switch 1 cart on the Switch 2 is maybe like doing some upscaling or something, because the games definitely look better on the Switch 2. So at the end of this first week with the Switch 2, I'd say my impressions of the Switch 2 are generally positive. Games look and run really nice. The eShop experience is obviously improved, and the backwards compatibility adds a lot. While there are some things like the virtual game card and then like the GameCube app being locked onto the Switch 2 and behind the Switch Online subscription and stuff that kind of drives me nuts. And I don't know. It's a new generation. With each generation of gaming, I feel like there's always a lot of pros and then some cons that get introduced. I'm interested to know what y'all think about the Switch 2 so far. What are your impressions? Hope you are enjoying your time with the Switch 2 if you are playing it. And if you plan on getting a Switch 2, good luck to you getting one. And until the next time, thank you for hanging out. Look forward to this channel for a more comprehensive review on the Switch 2 in the future, for a video on the Retroid Pocket 5 and some other handheld retro gaming devices, and some more reviews on indie games. Until the next time, take it easy out there, stay hydrated, and stay awesome. Deuces!